Welcome to my channel.
The wind whipped down from the towering peaks surrounding Lochdubh, carrying with it needles of ice that stung the face and the promise of a snowstorm that would likely bury the small Highland village until the new year. It was the kind of December weather that made sensible people bar their doors, stoke their fires, and stay put. Police Constable Hamish Macbeth was, generally speaking, a sensible man. He was currently located in the kitchen of the police station, his long, lanky frame draped over a hard wooden chair that he had long ago learned to find comfortable. His fiery red hair was, as usual, enduring a losing battle against gravity and tidiness, and his large hazel eyes were fixed meditatively on the sputtering flame of his erratic gas stove. On the stove bubbled a pot of coffee. It was not good coffee. It was thick, black, and strong enough to strip paint, which was exactly how Hamish liked it. Next to him, his small, nondescript dog, Lugs, let out a snore that sounded suspiciously like a deflating bagpipe. The telephone in the adjacent office began to ring. Hamish did not move. He did not twitch a muscle. He merely took a slow, noisy slurp from his chipped mug and watched the steam rise. The phone continued its angry, bureaucratic trill. It was undoubtedly headquarters in Strathbane. It was undoubtedly Detective Chief Inspector Blair wanting to know why Hamish hadn't filled out the 4-page survey on rural traffic cone deployment, or perhaps demanding he drive 20 miles over icy roads to investigate a reported sheep-worrying incident that would turn out to be a badger with a bad attitude. Hamish sighed, a sound like wind whistling through a cracked chimney. He hated ambition. He hated efficiency. Both of those things led to promotion, and promotion meant a transfer to Strathbane, a concrete jungle filled with actual crime, shouting superiors, and no opportunity to poach a salmon or sit and stare at the loch for 3 hours under the guise of surveillance. His entire career was a carefully constructed performance of incompetence designed to keep him exactly where he was. The phone finally gave up. Silence, heavy and cold, returned to the kitchen, save for the rattling lid of the coffee pot. "Right then, Lugs," Hamish murmured, standing up and stretching his long limbs. "Best see what the damage is outside before the snow really sets in." Lugs opened one eye, gave his master a look of profound betrayal, and went back to sleep. Hamish shrugged into his heavy police greatcoat, which always smelled faintly of wet dog and peat smoke no matter how often it was cleaned, and jammed his peaked cap onto his head. He stepped out the back door and was immediately assaulted by the freezing wind coming off the Atlantic. The village of Lochdubh looked grim. The waters of the loch were steel-grey and churning violently. The small whitewashed cottages huddled together against the blast, smoke whipping horizontally from their chimneys. There was no one on the waterfront street. Even the seagulls had enough sense to hide. Christmas was approaching, a season Hamish viewed with deep suspicion. In Lochdubh, Christmas meant an influx of relatives from the south who complained about the heating. Tourists seeking a picturesque winter getaway who inevitably drove their expensive cars into ditches, and forced joviality at the annual dinner dance at the Tommel Castle Hotel. It also usually meant trouble, and this year trouble had arrived early in the form of a bright yellow Range Rover Vogue, currently parked aggressively outside Patel's general store, taking up 2 spaces. Hamish pulled his collar up around his ears and bent into the wind, making his way toward the shop. He needed milk, and he needed to inspect the source of the garish vehicle. He pushed open the door of the shop, shivering as the bell tinkled cheerfully above his head. The warmth inside was welcome, though the atmosphere was decidedly frosty. Mr. Patel, a man of infinite patience who had seen everything Lochdubh could throw at him, was standing behind the counter with a strained smile fixed on his face. Facing him was a man who looked as if he had just stepped out of a glossy magazine advertisement for expensive, impractical country wear. The stranger was tall and broad, with hair the colour of expensive butter and a tan that certainly hadn't been acquired in Scotland. He wore a quilted Barber jacket that looked brand new, designer jeans tucked into Hunter Wellingtons that had never seen mud, and a cashmere scarf wrapped artfully around his neck. He was currently holding up a packet of standard digestive biscuits as if it were a dead rat. "I said," The man was booming in a voice that echoed painfully in the small shop. "Do you not have anything artisanal? A spelt oat cake? A quinoa crisp? Something that doesn't taste like cardboard dipped in sugar?" Mr. Patel bowed slightly. "I am very sorry, sir. We have digestives, rich tea, and hobnobs. The hobnobs are very popular." "Hobnobs," the man sneered, tossing the packet back onto the shelf, knocking over a display of canned peas. He didn't apologize. "God, this place is archaic. It's like stepping into the 1950s. How you people survive up here without decent provisions is beyond me." Hamish drifted toward the milk chiller, adopting his best simple village Bobby persona. He let his jaw go slack and widened his eyes into a bovine stare. The stranger turned, noticing Hamish for the first time. He looked the tall policeman up and down with undisguised amusement. "Ah, the local constabulary. Marvellous. Tell me, officer." "Macbeth, sir. PC Hamish Macbeth," Hamish said, adding a slight deferential shuffle to his stance. "Right, Macbeth. I'm Damien Croft Murray. I've just bought the old Ferguson place up on the ridge. The big wreck of a farmhouse?" Hamish nodded slowly. "Aye, sir. The sprawling ruin with the leaky roof and the dry rot." Croft Murray laughed, a loud, barking sound. It was a ruin. "I'm turning it into a luxury eco-lodge. The Highland Sanctuary. It's going to put this dreary little backwater on the map. We'll be flying in clients from London by helicopter." "Helicopters," Hamish repeated dully. "That will be nice for the sheep." "Sheep? Who cares about the sheep? It's about progress, man. Bringing some money into this god-forsaken rock pile." He turned back to Mr. Patel. "Look, just give me 20 Benson and Hedges and a bottle of whatever passes for decent whiskey up here, and try not to take all day. I have architects arriving within the hour." He threw a platinum credit card onto the counter with a clatter. Hamish selected his milk and moved to the counter, standing silently behind the large man. He watched as Croft Murray tapped his manicured fingers impatiently on the formica, while Mr. Patel processed the transaction. The air in the small shop fairly vibrated with Croft Murray's arrogance. It was a scent Hamish knew well, the scent of a Sassenach, or in this case, just a wealthy outsider regardless of origin, who believed the Highlands were a theme park created for their personal amusement and the locals' mere stuff. "Keep the change," Croft Murray said grandly, grabbing his items and brushing past Hamish without a backward glance. The shop door slammed open to a blast of wind and then slammed shut. Mr. Patel let out a long sigh and began restacking the tin cans. "A charmer," Hamish observed, placing his milk on the counter. "He has been in 3 times today," Mr. Patel said sadly. "He bought all the avocados this morning and complained they were too hard. Then he came back to complain there was no 4-gram signal at his property. The Ferguson place hasn't had a signal since the war, and that was smoke signals," Hamish murmured. "He's not going to be popular, Hamish," Mr. Patel said, looking worried. "Mrs. Wellington at the hotel is already furious because he tried to poach her head chef for his new eco-lodge. And he nearly ran over Archie McLean's sheepdog with that yellow tank of his." Hamish paid for his milk, his mind already cataloguing the friction points. In a closed ecosystem like Lochdubh, a man like Damien Croft Murray was an invasive species. He was loud, he was flashy, he had money, and he had absolutely no respect for the delicate, unspoken rules that kept the village from tearing itself apart. "Ah, well," Hamish said, tucking the milk under his arm, "maybe the snow will cool his jets a bit. The forecast says it's coming down hard tonight." He stepped back out into the biting cold. The sky had turned a bruised, purplish black. The first fat, heavy flakes of snow were beginning to fall, swirling madly in the gale. Hamish looked up toward the ridge that loomed over the village, where the old Ferguson farmhouse sat exposed to the elements. The yellow Range Rover was already roaring up the single-track road towards it. Hamish shivered, and not just from the cold. He had a feeling that Damien Croft Murray's Highland Sanctuary was going to be anything but peaceful. The man was practically begging for the village to chew him up and spit him out. Hamish just hoped it wouldn't happen before Christmas. He really didn't want to have to deal with Blair during the holidays. He turned and trudged back toward the police station, dreaming of his stove and the book he had hidden under his mattress. The snow did come down hard, burying Lochdubh in a thick, suffocating blanket of white that muffled every sound and turned the familiar landscape into an alien topography of drifts and hollows. By morning, the wind had died, leaving behind a silence so profound it felt heavy on the ears. For Hamish Macbeth, this silence was usually a gift. It meant the roads were impassable, the tourists were trapped in their hotels, and most importantly, DCI Blair in Strathbane would be unable to reach him. Hamish sat in his kitchen, wrapped in a dressing gown that had seen better decades, staring lovingly at a plate of fried eggs and bacon. The electricity had flickered and died sometime during the night, a common occurrence in the Highlands that usually sent the incomers into a panic, but merely prompted the locals to light their paraffin lamps. The police station was dim, warm, and smelled of frying fat. Heaven. He lifted his fork, anticipating the first perfect salty bite, when the universe decided to remind him that he was, unfortunately, a policeman. There was a hammering on the back door so violent it caused Lugs to leap from his basket with a yelp, his claws scrabbling on the linoleum. The knocking wasn't the polite rap of a neighbour borrowing sugar, it was the frantic, wood-splintering pounding of genuine hysteria. Hamish closed his eyes for a brief, pained moment, mourning the bacon that would now go cold. "Coming, coming. Hold your horses before you break the door down," he shouted, shuffling across the kitchen. He threw open the door to reveal Geordie Kevin, the village's somewhat unreliable builder who had been contracted, much to his own surprise, to work on the Ferguson renovations. Geordie was pale, his face a mask of terror, and he was shaking so hard the snow on his woolen hat was vibrating. "Hamish, you've got to come," Geordie gasped, his breath pluming in the freezing air. "It's the Sassenach. Mr. Croft Murray. He's—" "Oh God, Hamish, it's awful." "Calm down, Geordie," Hamish said, ushering the shivering man inside and shoving a mug of tea into his hands. "What's he done now? Complained about the colour of the snow?" "He's died, Hamish. Stone cold died," Geordie spluttered, spilling tea on his boots. "I went up early to check the generator like he ordered, and there he was. In the hot tub." Hamish's eyebrows rose. "The hot tub? In this weather? Aye. But the heater isn't wired in yet. It's just a tub of ice water." Hamish sighed, a long rattling sound of resignation. He looked at his cooling breakfast, then at the terrified builder. "Right. Give me a minute to get my boots." The drive up to the ridge was a nightmare of sliding tyres and revving gears. The Land Rover, a vehicle held together mostly by rust and Hamish's optimism, groaned as it fought the incline. Lugs sat in the passenger seat, looking deeply unimpressed by the outing, occasionally letting out a whine that perfectly harmonised with the straining engine. When they finally crested the hill, the Highland sanctuary stood stark against the grey sky. It was a mess of scaffolding, plastic sheeting and piles of expensive materials left to the mercy of the elements. And there, on the newly laid decking that overlooked the loch, sat the object of the commotion. Croft Murray was indeed dead, and true to his life, he had managed to make his death a spectacle of absurdity. He was sitting in the empty dry fiberglass shell of a luxury hot tub that had been delivered but not yet installed. He was wearing a silk dressing gown that had fallen open to reveal a pair of tartan boxer shorts, undoubtedly bought at an airport gift shop, and he was frozen solid. His skin was a shocking shade of blue-white, and his stiff arms were draped over the rim of the tub as if he were relaxing, in a spa, staring sightlessly out at the view he had claimed to own. To make matters worse, someone, or something, had placed a builder's hard hat jauntily on his head, slightly askew. "I didn't touch him, Hamish, I swear," Geordie wailed from behind him. "I just saw him and ran." Hamish stepped carefully onto the decking. The wood was slick with ice. He approached the body, his hands deep in his greatcoat pockets, his posture one of casual disinterest. To an observer, he looked like a man inspecting a fence post. In reality, his hazel eyes were darting everywhere, cataloguing details with the speed of a shutter. "Nasty way to go," Hamish drawled, leaning over the rim of the tub. "Hypothermia? Or did he slip and knock his head?" He peered closer. There was a dark, frozen patch of blood matted in the blonde hair just above the right ear, mostly hidden by the ridiculous hard hat, and on the decking, just near the tub, lay a heavy, gold-plated spade, a ceremonial shovel, likely intended for a press photo opportunity about breaking ground. The blade was clean, the handle lay suspiciously close to the tub. "Did you move that shovel, Geordie?" Hamish asked softly. "No, I told you I touched nothing." Hamish hummed. He looked around the scene, The snow on the decking was trampled, a mess of footprints. Geordie's heavy boots were obvious, but there were others, prints from a sleek, expensive shoe, likely the victim's, and another set, smaller, perhaps a size 7 or 8 boot, which had been partially swept away by the wind but were still faintly visible, leading away from the tub toward the back of the house. It wasn't an accident. You didn't smash your own head in with a ceremonial spade and then climb into a dry hot tub to die of exposure while wearing a hard hat. Hamish felt a surge of pure annoyance. This was murder. Murder meant paperwork. Murder meant the press. And worst of all, murder meant DCI Blair. Right, Hamish said, straightening up and turning his back on the gruesome sight. Geordie, go back to the village. Tell no one. And I mean no one. If I hear a whisper of this in the pub before I make the call, I'll arrest you for wasting police time. But who do I tell? You tell me, Hamish said firmly, and you've done that. Now, off you go. I have to secure the scene. As Geordie scrambled back to his van, sliding and cursing, Hamish stood alone on the windy ridge. He looked down at Lugs, who was sniffing interestedly at the gold shovel. Leave it, Lugs, Hamish muttered. That's evidence. Though, fat lot of good it will do us when Blair gets his paws on it. He walked a slow circle around the decking, his breath misting. The view from here was spectacular, the snowy peaks reflecting in the dark water of the loch below. It was a place of peace, violated by the ego of the man in the tub and the violence of the one who put him there. Hamish knew he should call headquarters immediately, but the lines were likely down, and the mobile signal up here was non-existent, as the late Mr. Croft Murray had so loudly complained. That meant he had a bit of time to look, time to think, and time to mourn his bacon before the circus arrived. He crouched down, examining the smaller footprints again. They were light, barely depressing the snow. A woman or a slight man? They didn't run, they walked. Calmly, deliberately. Well, Lugs, Hamish said, scratching the dog behind the ears. It seems Mr. Croft Murray annoyed one person too many. And considering he'd only been here a week, that's quite an achievement. He stood up, pulling his coat tighter against the returning chill. He needed to get back to the station and radio this in. The quiet days of winter were over. The great Lochdubh murder hunt was on, and Hamish Macbeth was already tired. Hamish sat in the freezing cab of the Land Rover, the engine idling roughly as he wrestled with the radio handset. The equipment was of a vintage that suggested it had seen action in several past conflicts, none of them recent. He depressed the button, listening to the crackle of static that sounded like frying bacon, a cruel reminder of his interrupted breakfast. When he finally got through to headquarters in Strathbane, the voice on the other end was sceptical, bordering on bored. Reporting a murder in Lochdubh was rare. Reporting a millionaire frozen in a hot tub wearing a hard hat was unheard of. He was told to stay put and touch nothing, an instruction Hamish found incredibly easy to follow given that the temperature outside was rapidly dropping. He waited as the grey light of the morning stretched into a dull, flat afternoon. He waited as Lugs curled up into a tight ball of resentment on the passenger seat, letting out occasional sighs that questioned Hamish's life choices. To pass the time, Hamish stared at the house. It was an ugly thing, really, a monument to money without taste, jutting out of the landscape like a sore thumb. It felt right that it should be the scene of a crime. The house itself was a crime against the architecture of the glen. The silence of the Highlands was finally shattered not by the wind, but by the distant, aggressive wail of sirens. It was a sound that made the local sheep lift their heads in mild confusion before returning to their grazing. A convoy of vehicles appeared on the lower road, struggling visibly as they hit the incline leading to the ridge. Wheels spun, engines whined, and Hamish watched with a small, grim smile as the heavy police saloons from Strathbane fought a losing battle against the Highland winter. It took them 20 minutes to navigate the driveway that Hamish's battered Land Rover had managed in 5. When the lead car finally skidded to a halt near the decking, the door flew open with violent force. Detective Chief Inspector Blair emerged, and the temperature seemed to drop another 10 degrees purely from the chill of his presence. Blair was a man who carried his anger like a heavy suitcase he refused to put down. He was short, thick-set, and currently wearing a cheap suit that was entirely inappropriate for the weather, covered by a raincoat that billowed around him like a tragic cape. His face, usually a florid red, was currently a mottled purple from the cold and the fury of the drive. Behind him trailed his usual shadows. Detective Sergeant Jimmy Anderson, and Detective Constable Harry McNabb, both looking hungover, bored, and shivering. "Macbeth!" Blair roared, his voice cracking like a whip. "Where is he? Where is the body? And why is this godforsaken track not gritted? I nearly put the car in a ditch." Hamish climbed out of the Land Rover, adopting his most bovine expression. He slouched, letting his shoulders drop and his mouth hang slightly open. It was a posture designed to lower expectations instantly. "The body is on the decking, sir. In the tub. Just as I found him." Blair stomped past him, nearly slipping on a patch of ice. He swore loudly, a string of profanities that echoed off the hills, and marched toward the hot tub. Hamish followed at a safe distance, Lugs trotting at his heels. Blair stared down at the frozen corpse of Damien Croft Murray. He looked at the hard hat. He looked at the ceremonial shovel. He looked at the tartan boxer shorts. "What a mess," Blair grunted, wiping his nose with a handkerchief that had seen better days. "Right, it's obvious what happened. Here. A domestic dispute. Or a robbery gone wrong. These rich types, they come up here, flash their cash, and get the locals riled up. There is the matter of the shovel, sir," Hamish ventured softly, "and the footprints." "I have eyes, Macbeth," Blair snapped, wheeling around. "I can see the bloody shovel, and don't talk to me about footprints. The snow is a mess. You've probably trampled all over the vital evidence with those clown shoes of yours." "I stayed clear, sir," Hamish lied smoothly. "But if you look closely at the smaller prints leading away—" "Smaller prints?" Blair scoffed. "Probably a woman, a lover, or a kid stealing apples. It's irrelevant. Look at the violence of the blow. This was a man's work, a strong man, probably one of those poaching louts you let run wild in the hills. Who was working on the house?" "Geordie Kevin, sir. He found the body." "Aha!" Blair pointed a thick finger at Hamish. "The builder. Dispute over payment. It's as plain as the nose on your face, Macbeth. Bring him in. I want him in the interview room at Strathbane by tonight." "Geordie is a wee bit timid, sir," Hamish said, scratching his head. "And he's about 5'4". He'd need a stepladder to hit a man of Croft Murray's size on the top of the head." Blair's face darkened, the purple shifting toward a dangerous crimson. "Are you questioning my assessment, Constable? Because last I checked, I was the Detective Chief Inspector, and you were the village idiot whose main duty is chasing stray cows. I don't need your Sherlock Holmes act. I need you to make yourself scarce. Go and direct traffic." "There is no traffic, sir, just the sheep." "Then direct the sheep. Just get out of my sight. Anderson, get the photographers over here before the snow covers everything. And get that body out of the tub. It's making me cold just looking at it." Hamish watched as the crime scene team, a group of men in white paper suits who looked like lost marshmallows, began to swarm the decking. They were clumsy, slipping on the wood, shouting over the wind. He saw one of them step directly onto the delicate small footprints he had noted earlier, obliterating them with a heavy boot. Hamish winced, a sharp pain of professional frustration hitting him, but he said nothing. To speak up now would only invite more wrath, and perhaps a transfer to the Glasgow beat. "Right you are, sir," Hamish said meekly. "I'll just be off then, to check the perimeter." "Go." Blair waved a hand dismissively, not even looking at him. "And Macbeth? If I find out you've been leaking stories to the press again, I'll have your badge. Now clear off." Hamish whistled for Lugs. They walked back toward the Land Rover, leaving the chaos of the official investigation behind them. Blair was barking orders, focusing entirely on the obvious, loud and incorrect theory that a local workman had snapped. He was ignoring the nuance, the strangeness of the scene, the bizarre staging of the body. As Hamish climbed into the driver's seat, he looked back one last time. Blair was standing over the body, hands on hips, the master of all he surveyed. Hamish put the car in gear. The heavy mob from Strathbane had arrived, and as usual, they were about to make a complete hash of it, which meant, unfortunately, that Hamish was going. To have to solve the murder himself, and he was going to have to do it without anyone noticing. "Come on, Lugs," he muttered, turning the heater up to full blast. "Let's go and see what the village gossip has to say. I have a feeling the truth is floating around at the bottom of a teacup somewhere, not up here in the freezing cold." He drove away slowly, the tyres crunching on the snow, leaving DCI Blair to shout at the wind. The Land Rover rattled and shook as it descended the track, a stark contrast to the sleek police cruisers that now cluttered the ridge like oversized beetles. Hamish Macbeth felt a profound sense of relief as the Highland sanctuary disappeared from his rearview mirror, replaced by the sleet grey expanse of the loch. Leaving DCI Blair to shout at the weather was one of life's great pleasures, but it did little to address the cavernous emptiness in Hamish's stomach. The failed breakfast attempt still haunted him, and the cold air of the crime scene had sharpened his appetite to a predatory edge. He knew exactly where he needed to go. The Tommel Castle Hotel was not only the source of the best food in Lochdubh, but it was also the central nervous system of the village's gossip network. He parked the Land Rover around the back of the Grand Hotel, a towering Victorian pile of stone that looked down on the village with aristocratic disdain. Lugs, sensing the proximity of high-quality leftovers, perked up immediately and hopped out, his tail wagging with rare enthusiasm. Hamish pushed open the heavy kitchen door, instantly enveloped in a cloud of warmth that smelled of roasting venison, rosemary, and baking bread. It was a scent that made his knees weak. The kitchen was a hive of activity, copper pans clattering and steam rising from giant stockpots. At the centre of the chaos stood the head chef, a man named Angus, who possessed a temper almost as volatile as his soufflés. However, Hamish had long ago learned that Angus had a soft spot for compliments regarding his gravy. "Grand day for a stew, Angus," Hamish announced, leaning casually against a butcher block and removing his cap. "The smell alone is enough to bring a man back from the dead." Angus paused mid-chop, eyeing the policeman suspiciously before his face softened into a begrudging grin. "Macbeth, I suppose you're here to sponge off the establishment again?" "We're not a charity for the constabulary. I was merely passing," Hamish lied effortlessly, his eyes drifting toward a tray of freshly baked scones cooling on a rack. "But I've been up at the Ferguson place all morning. A terrible business. Freezing cold and not a bite to eat since yesterday." He let his shoulders slump pathetically. Angus sighed, grabbing a bowl and ladling a generous portion of thick, dark stew into it, followed by a hunk of crusty bread. "Get that down you then, before Mrs. Wellington sees you." Hamish didn't need telling twice. He settled onto a stool in the corner, Lugs waiting expectantly by his feet for falling debris. The stew was magnificent, warming him from the inside out. He was halfway through the bowl when the swing doors flew open, and Mrs. Wellington, the hotel's formidable owner, swept in. She stopped dead when she saw him, her sharp eyes narrowing. "Hamish Macbeth," she barked, though there was no real malice in it. "I might have known. Is Blair up at the ridge? I can hear the sirens from here. Bad for business, police cars everywhere." "Aye, he's there," Hamish mumbled through a mouthful of venison, making a lot of noise and achieving very little, as usual. He's convinced it was Geordie Kevin. Mrs. Wellington let out a snort of derision that would have frightened a lesser man. "Geordie? The man apologises to furniture if he bumps into it. Blair is a fool, but I'm not surprised that Croft Murray met a sticky end. The man was a menace." Hamish swallowed and looked up, his expression one of mild bovine curiosity. "Oh? I thought he was just a bit loud. With his money." "Money?" Mrs. Wellington laughed, a harsh, dry sound. "That's the joke of it, Hamish. The man was all fur coat and no knickers, as they say. He came in here last night demanding the best table, ordering Dom Perignon. And do you know what happened when he tried to pay for his drinks at the bar?" Hamish shook his head slowly, scraping the bottom of his bowl. "I couldn't guess." "Card declined," she said with satisfaction. "Twice. He made a massive scene, blamed the machine, blamed the reception, blamed the satellite signal. But I know a declined card when I see one. He was desperate, Hamish, sweating like a pig." "Is that so?" Hamish asked softly. This was interesting. A broke millionaire was a different animal entirely from a rich one. Did he have anyone with him? Not at first. But later on, about 9 o'clock, a woman came in. She didn't look like a tourist, wrapped up in a scarf so you could barely see her face, but she had a stride I recognised. They sat in the corner, and they weren't whispering sweet nothings. It was a blazing row. Hushed but vicious. I heard him say, "You'll wait your turn like everyone else," and she knocked his glass over. "Did you see who it was?" Hamish asked, his hazel eyes suddenly sharp. "I didn't get a good look at her face," Mrs. Wellington admitted, frowning. "She rushed out right after, but she was small, and she was wearing a coat that looked far too big for her, like she'd grabbed it in a hurry." "Small," Hamish repeated. thinking of the delicate footprints Blair's team had likely obliterated by now, and he was broke. That is a very interesting combination. There's one more thing, Mrs. Wellington added, lowering her voice. After she left, he made a phone call. From the landline in the lobby because his mobile wouldn't work. I was at the desk. I heard him say, "If you don't fix this, I'm telling them about the girl." Then he slammed the phone down and stormed out into the snow. Hamish stood up, placing. His empty bowl in the sink. The lazy, food-obsessed demeanour dropped for a split second, replaced by a calculating intelligence. "The girl," he murmured. "Now that is a thread worth pulling. Don't you go solving this before Blair makes a complete idiot of himself," Mrs. Wellington warned, a smirk playing on her lips. "I enjoy watching him squirm." "I wouldn't dream of it," Hamish said, putting his cap back on. "I'm just a simple country policeman, Mrs. Wellington. I'm going to go and see if the sheep are all right." He whistled for Lugs. He had a full stomach, a new lead and a secret that DCI Blair would never find in a DNA lab. Damien Croft Murray wasn't just a victim, he was a blackmailer with a cash flow problem. And somewhere in Lochdubh, there was a small woman with a temper and a big coat who knew exactly why he was dead. Hamish stepped back out into the cold, but this time he didn't feel the chill. The hunt was on. Hamish wiped the last traces of venison stew from his mouth with the back of his hand, a gesture that would have horrified his mother had she been alive to see it, and pushed through the swing doors that separated the chaotic warmth of the kitchen from the hushed, velvet-draped elegance of the hotel proper. He wasn't technically supposed to be in the guest areas. DCI Blair would have an aneurysm if he knew a village constable was muddying the carpets of the Tommel Castle Hotel, but Hamish had a specific quarry in mind, and for once it wasn't a criminal. He found Priscilla Halberton Smythe in the drawing-room, standing by the roaring log fire. She was arranging a vase of winter lilies with the kind of effortless grace that made Hamish's heart ache in a way that had nothing to do with indigestion. She was wearing a cashmere sweater the colour of oatmeal and a skirt that probably cost more than Hamish's annual salary. Her blonde hair was swept back, revealing a face of cool, aristocratic beauty that had haunted Hamish's dreams for years. She looked up. As he approached, her ice-blue eyes softening slightly. There was always a barrier between them, an invisible wall built of money, class, and Hamish's stubborn refusal to be ambitious, but there was also a fondness that he clung to like a drowning man to a piece of driftwood. "Hamish," she said, her voice low and cultured. "I didn't think you'd be showing your face here today. Isn't the hotel swarming with Blair's men?" "They're busy measuring the depth of the snow and shouting at each other up on the ridge," Hamish said, drifting closer to the fire. He was conscious suddenly of his fraying cuffs and the smell of wet dog that clung to him. "I came for a word, and perhaps to escape the noise." Priscilla smiled, a small, knowing expression. "And for Angus's stew, I imagine. You look less famished than usual." She abandoned the lilies and sat on the arm of a leather sofa, gesturing for him to take the chair opposite. "So, Damien Croft Murray is dead. I can't say I'm entirely surprised, though the method sounds rather theatrical." "You knew him?" Hamish asked, sinking into the armchair and trying not to look too comfortable. "I knew of him," Priscilla corrected. "He moved in the sort of London circles that are desperate to appear wealthy but are usually drowning in debt, the trust fund set who spent the trust fund 10 years ago. He was a climber, Hamish, and not a very subtle one." Hamish nodded, his mind clicking over Mrs. Wellington's information. "That fits. Mrs. Wellington said his card was declined. He was putting on a show." "Exactly," Priscilla said, crossing her ankles. "Men like that are dangerous when they're cornered. They view the world as something that owes them a living. If he was broke, he would have been looking for a quick fix. A loan, a gamble, or leverage." "Leverage," Hamish repeated. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. Mrs. Wellington heard him arguing with a woman last night. A small woman in an oversized coat. He threatened her, said if she didn't fix something, he'd tell them about the girl. Priscilla's expression sharpened. She looked away, toward the fire, her brow furrowing. "The girl? That sounds specific. Not a girl, but the girl. It implies a shared history, or a shared secret." "Aye," Hamish said, "and I'm thinking this wasn't a lover's tiff. It sounded like blackmail. But who in Lochdubh has a secret worth killing over? And who has enough money to be worth blackmailing by a man used to London prices?" Priscilla looked back at him, her eyes serious. You're assuming he was blackmailing her for money, Hamish. But if he was truly desperate, maybe he was blackmailing her for something else. Access, influence, a place to hide. She paused, tapping a manicured fingernail against her chin. You mentioned the woman was small and wearing an oversized coat. Did Mrs. Wellington say anything else? Just that she kept her face hidden, and the coat was too big, like she'd grabbed it in a rush. Or borrowed it, Priscilla mused. Hamish, I saw someone leaving the hotel last night, about 9 o'clock. I was coming in from the car park. I saw a figure hurrying down the driveway, away from the lights. Hamish sat up straighter. Did you see her face? No. It was snowing too hard. But I noticed something about the way she moved. You know how tourists walk when it's icy? They shuffle. They panic. They hold on to the walls. Aye, Hamish agreed. Like penguins on a polished floor. This woman didn't shuffle, Priscilla said softly. She marched. She dug her heels in. She knew how to walk on ice without thinking about it. She wasn't a guest, Hamish. She was a local. The revelation hung in the warm air between them. A local woman, small, wearing a coat that didn't fit. Someone who walked with the confidence of a Highlander, but had a secret that could destroy her. A local, Hamish murmured. That narrows the field. But it also makes it harder. If it's one of our own, the village will. Close ranks. They won't talk to Blair. And they might lie to me. They won't lie to you if you don't ask them like a policeman, Priscilla said gently. You have a way of making people forget the uniform, Hamish. It's your greatest trick. She stood up, signalling the end of the interview. She walked over to him and placed a hand briefly on his shoulder. The touch burned through his heavy wool coat. Be careful, Hamish. If Croft Murray was desperate enough to blackmail someone here, he might have uncovered something truly ugly. The Highlands are good at burying secrets deep as the peat. Hamish stood, fighting the urge to cover her hand with his own. He knew the boundaries. He knew his place. I'll be careful, he promised. And Priscilla? Thank you. For what? For not treating me like the village idiot. She smiled, a genuine, dazzling smile that made his knees weak all over again. Oh, Hamish, you're many things, but you're certainly not an idiot. Just dreadfully lazy. Now go away before Blair finds you and accuses you of stealing the silverware. Hamish retreated into the hallway, his heart beating a little faster than necessary. He had a lead. The killer wasn't a mysterious London socialite or a passing stranger. It was a local woman, someone who knew the ice, someone small enough to wear a borrowed coat. And as he stepped out of the hotel's side door back into the biting wind, a name floated into his mind. A name connected to an old tragedy. A name that fit the description of small, and a person who had every reason to hate a man like Damien Croft Murray. He pulled his collar up. He needed to visit the post office. Not for stamps, but because Mrs. Macrum, the postmistress, knew exactly who had been receiving letters from London, and who had been trying to hide them. The romantic interlude was over, the mooching investigation was about to begin in earnest. The wind had picked up again, whistling through the telephone wires like a choir of demented banshees. As Hamish trudged down the seafront toward the post office, he walked with his head down, hands thrust deep into his pockets, appearing to the casual observer like a man defeated by the elements. In reality, his mind was racing with the precision of a Swiss watch, albeit one that was currently running on venison stew and suspicion. The Lochdubh post office was the hypothalamus of the village, the place where all information was regulated, processed, and occasionally leaked by the formidable Mrs. Macrum. To enter her domain was to submit to a spiritual X-ray. She was a woman of severe Calvinist principles who viewed the delivery of mail as a sacred duty and the existence of junk mail as a personal affront. Hamish pushed the door open, the bell announcing his arrival with a frantic jingle. The interior smelled of damp wool, floor polish, and the faint, dry scent of government adhesive. Mrs. Macrum was behind the counter, sorting a stack of letters with the speed and violence of a card sharp. She looked up over her spectacles, her expression suggesting that Hamish was about as welcome as a tax audit. If you're here for stamps, Hamish Macbeth, the price has gone up, she announced, not pausing in her sorting. And if you're here to avoid that shouting man from Strathbane, you can stand in the corner, but don't drip on my linoleum. You have a heart of gold, Mrs. Macrum, Hamish said, leaning his elbows on the counter and adopting his most harmless, vacant expression. "I am merely checking for official correspondence, and perhaps seeking shelter from the tyranny of DCI Blair." Mrs. Macrum sniffed. "That man is a heathen. I heard him blaspheming at the seagulls earlier. It is no wonder the Lord sent snow to cover his tracks." "Aye, he's a noisy one," Hamish agreed. He watched her hands flying over the envelopes. "I suppose he'll be wanting to interview everyone who had dealings with the deceased." "A popular man, Mr. Croft-Murray? Popular?" Mrs. Macrum stopped, sorting, and fixed Hamish with a look of withering scorn. "The man was a pestilence. He demanded his mail be delivered to the door of that ruin on the ridge, even though the path is a goat track, and the mail he was getting. Final demands in red envelopes. I may not read the letters, Hamish, but I know what a debt collection notice looks like. The man was drowning in paper." Hamish nodded slowly. This confirmed Priscilla's theory. Croft-Murray was broke and desperate. So he had no friends in the village then? No one he was close to? "He was trying to be close to anyone with a bank balance," Mrs. Macrum said darkly. "But he was asking questions too. Unsavoury questions." "Oh?" Hamish widened his eyes innocently. "About the fishing? About the tragedy? The Ferguson girl?" Hamish felt a sudden chill that had nothing to do with the draughty door. The Ferguson girl. It was a story from 10 years ago, a dark chapter Lochdubh had tried to forget. A local teenager, Catriona Ferguson, had fallen from the cliffs near the very house Croft-Murray had bought. It was ruled a tragic accident, a slip in the mist. "Why would he be asking about Catriona?" Hamish asked, his voice dropping. "He was asking who was with her that night," Mrs. Macrum whispered, leaning over the counter. "He was pestering people. He asked me if I remembered seeing anyone come back to the village late, and he was pestering her. Her, Lorna. Catriona's sister, Lorna Ferguson." Hamish pictured her instantly. She was the village librarian, a mouse of a woman, barely 5 feet tall, who scurried around Lochdubh as if apologising for her own existence. She lived a solitary life, defined entirely by the loss of her vibrant wild sister a decade ago. "Lorna is a quiet soul," Hamish said carefully. "She wouldn't hurt a fly." "Maybe not," Mrs. Macrum said, picking up her stamp canceller and bringing it down with a vicious thump. "But that man was pushing her. I saw them yesterday, near the harbour. He was." Looming over her, shouting. She looked like she was going to faint. And then later. She hesitated, glancing at the door to ensure they were alone. "Later?" Hamish prompted gently. "Later, just as the snow started proper, I saw her walking up the ridge road. I wouldn't have known it was her, except for the walk. She was marching, Hamish, not her usual scuttle, and she was wearing that old greatcoat of her father's. It swallowed her whole. Looked like a child playing dress-up, but she was moving fast." Hamish's heart gave a heavy thud. A small woman, a local who knew how to walk on ice, an oversized coat, a blackmailer threatening to tell them about the girl. It all fit with a terrifying, tragic logic. If Croft-Murray had found something in the old house, a diary, a letter, something that proved Catriona's death wasn't an accident, he would have used it. And Lorna, the terrified mouse, might have finally found her teeth. "You have a sharp eye, Mrs. Macrum," Hamish said, pushing himself off the counter. "You missed your calling as a detective." "I have eyes in my head, which is more than can be said for that Blair creature," she retorted. "He's just driven past, by the way." Sirens blazing again, heading toward Geordie Kevin's cottage. Hamish swore softly under his breath. "He's going to arrest Geordie." "Then you'd best be off," Mrs. Macrum said, shooing him. "Go and save the poor fool." Geordie couldn't kill a spider without weeping for a week. Hamish buttoned his coat, his mind racing. Blair was about to make a spectacular mistake, which would buy Hamish some time, but he needed to get to Lorna Ferguson before she cracked, or before she did something even more desperate. The image of the Highlands sanctuary sat in his mind, not as a renovation project, but as a tomb that had refused to keep its secrets. "Thank you, Mrs. Macrum," Hamish said, touching the peak of his cap. "I'll see what I can do." "And Hamish," she called out as he reached the door, "if you do, solve it. Try to make sure Blair falls in a snowdrift, for the good of the village." Hamish stepped out into the biting cold, a grim smile playing on his lips. He had his suspect, he had the motive, And he had the witness. Now he just had to stop his boss from ruining everything. He whistled for Lugs, who was investigating a frozen chip wrapper near the gutter, and climbed back into the Land Rover. The engine coughed into life, and Hamish Macbeth drove toward the chaos, ready to play the part of the fool once again. The blue lights of the police cruisers were already flashing rhythmically against the darkening sky when Hamish arrived at Geordie Kevin's cottage, painting the snow-covered lane in strobe light spasms of azure. The scene was chaotic and loud, a direct violation of the peaceful winter evening Hamish had been hoping for. Detective Chief Inspector Blair was standing by the open door of a police car, looking like a conquering general who had just successfully besieged a shed. 2 constables were dragging a sobbing Geordie Kevin toward the vehicle. Geordie, whose resistance usually extended only to complaining about the price of plasterboard, looked utterly broken, his feet skidding uselessly on the ice. "I didn't do it," Geordie wailed, his voice cracking with hysteria. "I only went up to check the generator. I wanted my money, but I didn't bash him. I'm a pacifist. I don't even kill slugs." "Save it for the tape recorder, you murderous little weasel," Blair sneered, slamming the car door shut with a finality that made Hamish wince. He turned and saw Hamish standing by the Land Rover, hands in pockets, looking for all the world, like a man watching a minor traffic dispute. "Ah, Macbeth. Just in time to see real police work. We found the murder weapons receipt in his van. A spade. He bought it 3 weeks ago." "A spade is a common tool for a builder, sir," Hamish observed mildly, his breath misting in the cold air. "And Geordie is frightened of his own shadow. He once called me to remove a moth from his bathroom. Desperation changes a man," Blair declared, puffed up with self-importance. He was owed £5,000. He snapped. "Case closed. I'll be back in Strathbane by supper, leaving you to your sheep and your incompetence." Hamish watched the convoy peel away, tyres spinning on the slush, carrying the innocent builder to a night of terrifying interrogation. He felt a flash of genuine anger, quickly suppressed. Blair's rush to judgment was useful. It cleared the stage. The police presence in Lochdubh would now evaporate as they hauled their prize back to the city, leaving the village quiet, the roads empty, and the real killer believing they were safe. He climbed back into the Land Rover, Lugs giving a sympathetic whine from the passenger seat. "Don't worry, boy," Hamish murmured, putting the vehicle in gear. "Geordie will be fine for a few hours. Blair will be too busy writing his press release to rough him up just yet. We have a library to visit." The Lochdubh Library was housed in a converted chapel near the waterfront, a draughty stone building that smelled permanently of damp paper and floor wax. It was officially closed, but a dim light still burned in the back office. Hamish tried the door. It was unlocked. He slipped inside, the silence of the room pressing against his ears. Rows of books stood like silent witnesses in the gloom. He found Lorna Ferguson standing on a step stool in the biography section, shelving books with mechanical, jerky movements. She was a tiny woman, barely 5 feet tall, with mouse-brown hair pulled back in a severe bun and large, nervous eyes that looked perpetually startled. She wore a thick wool cardigan that seemed to swallow her frame, and Hamish noted instantly that her shoes, sturdy, sensible walking boots, were still wet with melting snow. "Working late, Lorna?" Hamish asked softly. Lorna gasped, dropping a copy of Churchill, a life which hit the floor with a gunshot crack. She spun around, clutching her chest. "Hamish, you frightened the life out of me. I was just catching up. The snow kept people away, so I thought I'd organise the stacks." Hamish bent down and picked up the book, dusting it off carefully before handing it back to her. He didn't smile. His face was kind, but his eyes were hard, focused. "The snow didn't keep everyone away, did it? You were out in it earlier." I went to the shop," she stammered, her gaze darting to the door. "For milk. Mr. Patel says you haven't been in for 2 days." Hamish lied gently. It was a gamble, but a safe one. "And Mrs. Macrum saw you walking up the Ridge Road yesterday evening, wearing your father's old greatcoat. It's a heavy coat, Lorna. Good for hiding things, like a shape or a spade handle." Lorna froze on the step stool. The colour drained from her face, leaving her looking like a wax doll. "I don't know what you mean. Geordie Kevin killed him. I heard the sirens. The police have arrested him." "Blair has arrested him," Hamish corrected. "Blair is a fool who sees what he wants to see. I see what's actually there. I see a man who was broke, desperate and cruel. A man who bought a ruin that used to belong to your family. And I see a woman who has spent 10 years trying to be invisible. He took a step closer, lowering his voice. What did he find in the house, Lorna? Was it a diary? A letter? Lorna began to tremble, a violent shaking that rattled the step stool. She stepped down, her legs seeming to give way, and collapsed into a nearby chair. She covered her face with her hands, her shoulders heaving. He was going to print it, she whispered, her voice a jagged shard of sound. He found Catriona's journal. It had slipped behind the wainscoting in her old bedroom. He found it when they tore the walls down. And what was in the journal? Hamish asked, though he already sensed the shape of the tragedy. Lorna looked up, her eyes swimming with tears. The truth, that it wasn't an accident. Catriona didn't slip. We fought. She was leaving. She was going to run away with a married man, leave me alone with father. I tried to stop her. I grabbed her arm. She pulled away, and she fell. She sobbed, a raw, ugly sound. It was my fault. I killed my sister, and that monster, that awful yellow-haired monster, he laughed. He said it was a juicy story. He wanted £10,000 or he'd send it to the papers. He said he'd make sure everyone knew I was a fratricide. Hamish looked at the small, weeping woman. It wasn't greed. It wasn't cold-blooded malice. It was terror. The fear of shame, the fear of losing the only thing she had left, her anonymity and her place in the village. Damien Croft Murray hadn't been murdered for money. He had been murdered because he tried to monetize a tragedy. So you went up there, Hamish said quietly. You took the coat to hide your face. You argued. I begged him, she cried. I begged him to give it back. He was in that tub, drinking, laughing at me. He burned a page of it right in front of me with his lighter. He said I was pathetic. Her hands clenched into fists. The shovel was there. I didn't think. I just wanted him to stop laughing. I just wanted silence. Hamish sighed, the weight of the confession settling on him. He believed her. It was a crime of passion, born of grief and bullying. But now, he had a problem. Blair had Geordie. Lorna had confessed to Hamish, but there was no evidence other than her word and the missing journal, which Croft Murray had likely destroyed or hidden. If Hamish arrested her now, she would crumble in Strathbane, and Blair would somehow twist it to make himself look like a genius while destroying this fragile woman. "Where is the journal now, Lorna?" Hamish asked. I don't know. He didn't have it on him. He said it was his insurance policy. He hid it somewhere safe. Hamish's mind raced. If the journal was still out there, it was a ticking bomb. But it was also the key. He looked at Lorna, who was waiting for the handcuffs. "Go home, Lorna," Hamish said abruptly. She blinked, stunned. "What?" "Go home. Lock your door. Say nothing to anyone, especially not to the police. But aren't you going to arrest me?" "Not yet," Hamish said, turning toward the door. "Because right now, officially, Geordie Kevin is the suspect, and until I find that journal, I can't prove a thing." "But Lorna?" He paused, his hand on the latch, looking back at her with a mix of pity and warning. "Don't think about running. The roads are blocked. And I'm the only friend you have right now." He stepped out into the night. He hadn't arrested her, which was technically a dereliction of duty, but Hamish Macbeth operated on Highland justice, not the rule book. He needed to find that journal before Blair's team did. And to do that, he needed to think like a man who was arrogant, paranoid, and obsessed with his own cleverness. He needed to set a trap, not for the killer, but to force the truth into the light in a way that he could control. The mooching was over. Now came the game. Hamish sat in the idling Land Rover outside the library for a long moment, the engine chugging rhythmically like the heartbeat of a dying beast. Lugs, sensing the shift in his master's mood from hunger to grim determination, nudged his wet nose against Hamish's elbow. The confession from Lorna Ferguson hung in the cold air of the cab, heavy and suffocating. Justice, Hamish had long decided, was not always the same thing as the law. The law, as represented by DCI Blair, was a blunt instrument that would crush a woman like Lorna for the crime of being terrified, while a man like Damien Croft Murray would have been allowed to destroy lives for profit had he lived. But knowing the truth and proving it, or rather proving the version of it that Hamish wanted the world to see, were two very different things. He couldn't just hand the journal over to Blair. That would be a one-way ticket to a life sentence for Lorna. He needed to control the narrative. He needed the journal, but he needed to find it before anyone else did, and he needed to present it in a way that exposed Croft Murray's villainy first and the crime second. He threw the Land Rover into gear and swung the wheel around, heading not toward the police station, but back up the treacherous, winding road to the ridge. The snow was falling thicker now, a white curtain that obscured the headlights, forcing Hamish to drive by memory and instinct. When he reached the Highland sanctuary, the scene was desolate. The police tape fluttered violently in the gale, a yellow ribbon snapping against the grey dark. As Hamish had predicted, Blair's team had retreated to the warmth of Strathbane or the local pub, leaving the scene minimally guarded. In fact, it wasn't guarded at all. The patrol car that should have been stationed there was gone, its driver likely having decided that hypothermia was not in the job description. Hamish parked the Land Rover out of sight behind a stack of rotting timber and approached the yellow Range Rover on foot. The vehicle sat like a stranded submarine in the snow, its windows frosted over. It was the only secure place on the property. Croft Murray wouldn't have hidden his insurance policy in the damp, unlockable ruin of the farmhouse, nor in the open air, where the builders worked. He would have kept it in the one place that smelled of his own expensive leather and filtered air. Hamish pulled a thin, bent piece of wire from his pocket, a tool he usually reserved for tricky locks on poaching excursions, and slid it between the window glass and the rubber seal of the driver's door. He worked with the patience of a man who had all night, his tongue poking slightly from the corner of his mouth. With a satisfying click, the lock popped up. He slipped inside, the interior light disabled by the dead battery, or perhaps a fuse Croft Murray had blown in a rage. He clicked on his torch. The car was a shrine to consumerism, empty coffee cups, crumpled receipts, and the lingering scent of expensive cologne. Hamish ignored the glove box, too obvious. He checked under the seats, nothing but dust and a stray golf ball. He turned his attention to the back seat. There, wedged between a pile of fabric swatches and a box of high-end tiles, was a black plastic tube, the kind used by architects to carry blueprints. It was labelled Sanctuary, Phase 1. Hamish unscrewed the cap. Inside, rolled tightly within a set of plans for a glass-walled sauna, was a small leather-bound book. It was old, the cover worn and stained with age, Catriona Ferguson's diary. Hamish unfurled it, his breath hitching as he scanned the final pages. It was all there. The teenage romance, the fear, the argument on the cliffs, and the tragic fall. But tucked into the back cover was something else, a folded sheet of modern-headed notepaper. It was a draft letter from Croft Murray to Lorna, detailing his demands. £10,000, or the Daily Record gets the story of the killer librarian. It was vile, it was predatory, and it was exactly what Hamish needed. He shoved the journal and the letter into his greatcoat pocket. He now held the power to destroy Lorna or save her. If he destroyed the book, the motive disappeared, but Geordie Kevin might hang for a crime he didn't commit. If he handed it in, Lorna was finished. He needed a third option. He needed Blair to find the evidence, but only after Hamish had set the stage. He needed to turn this from a murder investigation into a revelation of blackmail, making the death appear as a tragic, inevitable consequence of Croft Murray's own cruelty. Hamish stepped back out into the storm, relocking the car door with a practiced shimmy. He patted his pocket, feeling the weight of the book against his ribs. The trap was forming in his mind. He wouldn't solve the case, he would lead Blair to the solution. But he would make sure the path led through the muddy waters of Croft Murray's corruption first. "Right, Lugs," he whispered to the wind, trudging back to his vehicle. "It's time to make a phone call, and I think I'll need to sound sufficiently stupid to make Blair believe he's having a brilliant idea." He climbed into the Land Rover, the cold metal of the door handle biting his fingers. He had the bait. Now he just needed the beast to bite. The drive back to the station felt shorter this time. The uncertainty was gone, replaced by the thrilling tension of the game. Hamish Macbeth was about to manipulate the law to serve justice, and God help DCI Blair if he got in the way. Hamish stood in the freezing darkness of the ridge, the wind howling around him like a tormented spirit. He felt a peculiar heaviness in his chest, the weight of the decision he had just made. In his hands, the leather-bound diary of Catriona Ferguson felt less like a book and more like a grenade. He was about to tamper with evidence, mislead a superior officer, and manipulate the course of justice, all offences that would see him stripped of his uniform and likely thrown in a cell next to Geordie Kevin. But as he looked at the garish yellow Range Rover, now slowly being reclaimed by the drifting snow, he knew he had no choice. The law would see a murder. Hamish saw a desperate act of self-defense against a man who used ink and paper as weapons. He opened the passenger door of the Range Rover, the interior light flickering weakly. With the precision of a burglar, he placed the black plastic tube on the leather seat. He didn't put it back in the back. He left it prominently displayed, the cap unscrewed, the roll of blueprints protruding slightly. Tucked clearly inside the blueprints, the edge of the diary and the blackmail letter were visible to anyone who bothered to look. And DCI Blair, for all his faults, was a man who looked very closely at things he thought might bring him glory. Hamish wiped the door handle with the sleeve of his greatcoat, obliterating his own fingerprints, and stepped back. He left the door unlatched, just enough so the interior light would drain the last of the battery, or at least catch the eye of a passing patrol. "There," he whispered into the gale, "a nice present for the Chief Inspector." He climbed back into the Land Rover, lugs shivering against his thigh. The drive back to the police station was a blur of white headlights and black ice. Hamish's mind was rehearsing his lines. He needed to be the perfect idiot. He needed to be so tantalizingly vague that Blair would be forced to return to Lochdubh tonight, driven by the fear that his subordinate was about to accidentally solve the case and steal the credit. Back in the warmth of the station kitchen, Hamish put the kettle on. He waited for it to boil, made a pot of tea, and poured a mug for himself and a saucer for Lugs. Only then, with a deep, steadying breath, did he pick up the phone and dial the number for Strathbane headquarters. "Strathbane Police," a bored voice answered. "Put me through to DCI Blair," Hamish said, adding a quaver of panic to his voice. "It is an emergency. This is PC Macbeth." There was a click, a long silence, and then the explosion of Blair's voice. "Macbeth, I am in the middle of a steak and kidney pie. Unless the village is on fire, this had better be good." "Oh, sir," Hamish wailed, sounding suitably pathetic. "I am terrible worried. I think I have made a mistake." "A mistake? You were born a mistake. What have you done?" "It is the car, sir, the yellow one. I was just up there, checking the sheep, and I saw the door was open." "Open? I told you to secure the scene." "I know, sir, but I didn't touch it. Only I shone my torch inside, and I saw something, a tube, with papers. Blueprints, you idiot." "We saw them." "I said blueprints. But, well, I thought I saw a name on the paper inside. A letter. It looked like a threat, sir, about money, and it wasn't addressed to Geordie Kevin." Silence on the line. Hamish could hear Blair chewing, then the sudden cessation of chewing. "Not Geordie? Who then?" "I couldn't quite see, sir. I didn't want to touch it in case of fingerprints. But it looked like a woman's handwriting on the book inside. And the letter, it mentioned the Daily Record. The press?" Blair's voice sharpened instantly. "The mention of newspapers was like blood in the water to a shark. You didn't read it?" "Oh no, sir, I wouldn't dare." "But if it's evidence, and the door is open, and the snow is blowing in—" "Stay there," Blair roared. "Don't touch anything. Don't let anyone near that car. I'm coming back. If you've contaminated a new lead, Macbeth, I'll have you directing traffic in the Hebrides." The line went dead. Hamish replaced the receiver with a gentle click and a small, satisfied smile. He took a sip of his tea. It was perfectly brewed. He had perhaps an hour before Blair arrived, an hour to sit by the stove, warm his feet, and prepare for the final act. He wasn't saving Lorna from the law completely. She had killed a man, after all. But he was ensuring that when the handcuffs went on, the narrative would be firmly established. Blair would find the blackmail note first. He would read about the extortion, the cruelty, the threat to a grieving. By the time he arrested Lorna, she wouldn't be a cold-blooded killer in his eyes. She would be the victim who snapped, a much harder conviction to secure and a much better story for the press, which Blair cared about more than justice anyway. Hamish broke a digestive biscuit in half and gave a piece to Lugs. "We are bad policemen, Lugs," he murmured affectionately. "But I think we are doing a good job." The wind rattled the window panes, but inside, the trap was set. The bait was taken, and the hunter was speeding through the snow, completely unaware that he was the one being hunted. The wait for Detective Chief Inspector Blair was a masterclass in patience, a virtue Hamish Macbeth possessed in abundance, largely because it required absolutely no physical effort. He sat by the stove, the warmth seeping into his bones, listening to the gale rattle the sash windows of the police station. Lugs snored rhythmically at his feet, a furry barometer of the station's tranquility. Hamish knew that this peace was fragile, a temporary bubble that would be popped the moment the headlights of the Strathbane convoy cut through the gloom. He used the time to compose his face into a mask of rustic simplicity, practicing a look of mild confusion that usually sent Blair into a frenzy of superiority. The inevitable arrival was announced not by a knock, but by the screech of brakes and the slamming of car doors that echoed like gunshots in the quiet village street. The station door flew open, admitting a blast of freezing air and a flurry of snow, followed closely by DCI Blair. The man looked like a furious thundercloud stuffed into an overcoat. His face was a map of indignation, red-cheeked and streaming with melting snowflakes. Behind him, Detective Sergeant Anderson looked miserable, his nose dripping, clearly regretting every life choice that had led him to a career in law enforcement in the Highlands. "Macbeth!" Blair roared, shaking himself like a wet terrier. "This better. Be good. I was halfway to a warm bed. If you've dragged me back here for a false alarm, I'll have you peeling potatoes in Barlinnie prison." "Oh, sir, I am sorry," Hamish stammered, standing up and nearly knocking over his chair in a performance of startled incompetence. "It is just the car, sir. The window. It looked disturbed. I didn't want to be responsible if the evidence got wet." "Evidence getting wet?" Blair sneered, marching over to the stove and warming his hands aggressively. "You mean you panicked? Right. Get your coat. We're going up. And if this turns out to be nothing but a draft, God help you." The drive back up to the Highland sanctuary was a tense affair. Hamish insisted on driving the Land Rover, claiming the police saloon would never make the climb in the fresh snow. Blair sat in the passenger seat, gripping the dashboard with white knuckles as the vehicle slid and bucked over the icy track. Hamish drove with a terrifying casualness, humming a vague tune, seemingly unaware that they were inches from sliding off the precipice into the dark waters of the loch below. When they reached the ridge, the yellow Range Rover was a spectral shape in the swirling snow. The driver's door was indeed unlatched, swinging slightly in the wind, exactly as Hamish had left it. The interior light had died, leaving the cabin in darkness. "You see, sir?" Hamish shouted over the wind, pointing a wavering finger. It was just flapping about. Blair grunted, snatching a high-powered flashlight from Anderson. "Stand back, you clown! Don't trample the snow any more than you already have." He approached the vehicle with the exaggerated caution of a bomb disposal expert, beaming the light into the interior. Hamish held his breath. He had placed the tube prominently, but with Blair, one could never be sure if he would notice an elephant in a bathtub. "Hello," Blair murmured, the anger in his voice replaced by a predatory purr. "What have we here?" He reached in, ignoring his own previous lectures about fingerprints, and grabbed the black plastic tube. He unscrewed the cap, his thick fingers clumsy with the cold. Hamish watched as Blair pulled out the roll of blueprints. The leather-bound diary slid out with them, landing softly on the leather seat. The blackmail letter, caught in the draft, fluttered like a wounded moth before Blair snatched it out of the air. "A book?" Blair squinted at it, playing his torch beam over the faded cover. Catriona Ferguson, 2015. He opened it, scanning the pages, then turned his attention to the letter. As he read, his expression shifted. The irritation vanished, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated glee. It was the look of a man who saw not justice, but a headline. "Mother of God," Blair whispered, a puff of steam escaping his lips. "Macbeth, you lucky imbecile. Do you know what this is? Is it a shopping list, sir?" Hamish asked, widening his eyes. "It's a motive," Blair shouted, waving the letter in the air. "It's blackmail. Croft Murray wasn't killed for money, he was killed for silence. He was bleeding the Ferguson girl dry, or rather her sister. This letter, it's addressed to Lorna Ferguson." "Lorna?" Hamish gasped, putting a hand to his mouth. "The librarian? But she's so quiet." "It's always the quiet ones," Blair declared, feeling like a genius. "The repressed anger, the psychological snap, it's perfect. Librarian slays tormentor in Highland tub. The press will eat it up with a spoon." He turned to Anderson. "Forget the builder. Kevin is a red herring. Get on the radio. Tell the station to hold Kevin but prepare a cell for a female. We're going to the library." "But, sir," Hamish interjected softly, "Lorna lives in the cottage behind the manse. And she might be frightened." "Frightened?" Blair laughed, a harsh barking sound. "She's a killer, Macbeth. She bashed a man's brains in with a shovel. I don't care if she's frightened. I care that she's in cuffs." Before the morning news. Hamish nodded, looking at his boots. He had given Blair the victory, but he had also bought Lorna a narrative. She wasn't a cold-blooded murderer anymore. She was the victim of a monster, a woman pushed to the brink by a blackmailer. It wouldn't save her from prison, but it would save her from being painted as a villain. "I can show you the house, sir," Hamish said meekly. "If you like. Get in the car, Macbeth," Blair commanded, clutching the diary to his chest like a holy relic. "And try not to crash. I have a press conference to plan." As they began the descent, leaving the desolate crime scene behind, Hamish felt a strange mixture of relief and sadness. The trap had sprung perfectly. The mooching was done. All that remained now was the final messy business of the arrest, and Hamish intended to be the first through the door, if only to stop Blair from breaking it down. The game was over, and as usual, the wrong man was taking the credit, which was exactly how Hamish Macbeth liked it. The convoy skidded to a halt outside Lorna Ferguson's cottage, the headlights cutting through the swirling snow to illuminate the small, whitewashed building. It looked fragile against the dark bulk of the mountains, much like its inhabitant. DCI Blair was out of the car before the engine had fully died, marching up the garden path with the swagger of a man about to make history. Hamish followed at a more leisurely pace, his heart heavy but his conscience clear. He knew what was about to happen would be unpleasant, but it was necessary. "Open up! Police!" Blair bellowed, hammering on the front door with a fist like a ham. "We know you're in there!" There was a pause, a silence that seemed to stretch for an eternity, before the latch clicked. The door opened slowly to reveal Lorna. She was still wearing the oversized cardigan, her face pale and drawn, but her eyes were dry. She looked past the hulking form of Blair and locked eyes with Hamish. "In that?" Brief exchange, a silent understanding passed between them. She saw that he hadn't betrayed her, he had contextualized her. "Lorna Ferguson," Blair announced, pulling himself up to his full, unimpressive height. "I'm arresting you for the murder of Damien Croft Murray. You do not have to say anything, but it may harm your defense if you do not mention when questioned, something which you later rely on in court. And I have the diary. I know about the blackmail." Lorna didn't flinch. She simply nodded. "I understand," she said, her voice small but steady. "I won't give you any trouble." Blair looked almost disappointed. He had evidently been hoping for a struggle, something to justify his adrenaline. "Right. Anderson. Cuff her. Read her the rest of the rights. I want her in the car now. I'll just get her coat, sir," Hamish interjected softly, stepping past Blair into the hallway. "It's bitter out." He grabbed the heavy coat from the hook, the same coat she had worn to the ridge, and draped it over her shoulders. As he did so, he leaned in close. "It's the blackmail, Lorna," he whispered, barely moving his lips. "That's the story. You were defending your sister's memory. Stick to that. The jury will weep." She gave a tiny, imperceptible nod. "Thank you, Hamish." Blair was already barking orders into his radio, demanding a press liaison officer be woken up in Strathbane. He watched with a smug satisfaction as Lorna was led to the police car, not as a monster, but as a tragic figure caught in the beam of his own brilliance. "You see, Macbeth?" Blair sneered, turning to Hamish as the car door slammed shut. "That is how you close a case. Instinct, tenacity. While you were driving around looking at sheep, I was connecting the dots, the open car door, the missing diary. It all pointed to a crime of passion." "You are a genius, sir," Hamish said, adopting his most vacant expression. "I would never have thought to look in the car again." "Exactly," Blair preened. "That's why. I'm the chief inspector and you're, well, you. Now, I'm taking the prisoner back to headquarters. You can clean up here. And for God's sake, release that builder. What was his name? Georgie? Geordie, sir, whatever. Cut him loose. I have bigger fish to fry." With a roar of engines and a final flash of blue lights, the heavy mob departed, taking the noise and the chaos with them. Hamish was left standing alone in the garden, the snow settling on his cap. The silence of the Highlands rushed back in to fill the void, heavy and comforting. He walked back to the Land Rover, where Lugs was sleeping soundly, unbothered by the drama of human justice. Hamish drove back to the station slowly, enjoying the empty roads. He stopped briefly at Geordie Kevin's cottage to deliver the news that he was a free man, a revelation that caused Geordie to weep with relief and immediately offer to fix Hamish's roof for free, an offer Hamish intended to accept before Geordie sobered up. By the time Hamish returned to the police station, the sun was beginning to threaten the eastern horizon, painting the snow in shades of bruised purple and pink. He was exhausted, hungry, and his uniform felt like it was made of lead. Inside the kitchen, the fire in the stove had died down to embers. Hamish coaxed it back to life, filling the kettle. He sat at the table and unfolded the morning edition of the Strathbane Herald, which had been delivered through the letterbox. The headline would be different tomorrow. Tomorrow, it would be all about the tragedy of the Ridge and DCI Blair's brilliant deduction. Hamish smiled. It was perfect. Blair would get the credit, which meant Blair would get the promotion. And if Blair got the promotion, he would stay in Strathbane, far away from Lochdubh. Hamish, meanwhile, would remain exactly where he was, the useless village bobby who was too slow to solve a crime. "Well, Lugs," Hamish said, pouring boiling water into the teapot. "We survived another one." He thought of Lorna. She would go to prison certainly, but for manslaughter, not murder. The press would paint her as a martyr, a loyal sister pushed too far by a London shark. The village would support her. Mrs. Wellington would probably send her hampers. It wasn't a happy ending, but it was the best ending available in a world that was rarely black and white. He took a sip of tea and reached for the tin of shortbread he kept hidden behind the flour jar. He looked out the window at the loch, calm and steel grey under the winter sky. The phone began to ring in the office. It was undoubtedly the press, or perhaps headquarters wanting a report. Hamish Macbeth took another bite of shortbread, leaned back in his chair, and let it ring. He was off duty, and besides, there was a pot of coffee to be made. The mystery was solved, the dead were at rest, and the living were left to navigate the snow as best they could. And that, Hamish decided, was quite enough work for one winter.